Caseworkers are stretched thin, balancing high caseloads and endless paperwork. But with SpeakRight, documentation doesn't have to mean burnout. SpeakRight's Protective Services transcription cuts paperwork time dramatically, so you can meet deadlines, reduce overtime, and focus on what truly matters, the families you serve. With SpeakRight's free mobile app and desktop platform, caseworkers can capture detailed narratives anytime, anywhere, with just one tap to upload. SpeakRight is proven to lower stress and turnover, helping agencies retain dedicated staff while improving case quality. Don't let documentation slow you down. Let SpeakRight do the heavy lifting. Visit speakright.com/imprint to see how SpeakRight can transform your agency today. That's SpeakRight, SpeakWrite.com/imprint.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safecamp Audio on social media. So on this episode, we are going to have Cheyanne Deopersaud on to talk about the youth-led Mayoral Forum she is putting on in New York City. And then we will get to a whole bunch of headlines for the month. But before we do any of that, if you will indulge me a bit, because today you are hearing the 200th episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. So it's a journey that began in October of 2020 while we were all pretty much in the solitary world of COVID. And now here we are. I looked up some stats about podcast survival. Here's what I found. According to Buzzsprout, which is actually the service we use to distribute the Imprint Weekly Podcast, 90% of podcasts don't get past episode 3. And of those that do continue past the 3rd episode, another 90% quit after 20 episodes. And then I found in the Podmatch report that there are only about 9% of podcasts make it to a 50th episode, 4.8% make it to 100, and then 2.3% make it to 200 episodes. And then another 2.9% make it to a 300th episode. So we'll do our best to keep this thing going into that 300th. So before we start out today, though, I did want to thank first, really, everybody who has subscribed or rated this show or just listened to the podcast, streamed it, listened to it online, whatever. It's always awesome and validating to hear that people listen to it and email thoughts on the things that we've talked about, just as it is when people engage with reporting at the Imprint. I think my favorite weird podcast moment was walking down the hallway at a conference. I think it was in Baltimore, and I was just chit-chatting with somebody, and somebody walking by the other way just kind of wheeled around and said, the Imprint Weekly Podcast, because they recognized my voice. That was really funny. Now, more specifically, there are a few folks who, without them, we'd be in the podcast graveyard many episodes ago and would not have sniffed 200 episodes. First, just really everybody that's involved with producing the Imprint, our reporters, our editors who supply and inform much of what we talk about here. So as a group, they deserve a ton of credit. Christy Rennick, our co-executive director for Fostering Media Connections, my partner in crime. I'm her co-executive director who makes this place and thus the podcast operate. Kim Hansel and Deborah Denzel, who work super hard to find support through philanthropy and through marketing to support this show. That is a great way you can support the show. If you have a business or an organization that you want to promote, hit us up. And the person we most owe the survival of this show to, you hear her name every week, the wizard, Christina Joko. She produces this show. She edits this show. She does all the design for our promotions. And that's on top of all of her other artistic contributions to the Imprint and to Fostering Media Connections, our parent organization. A few fun facts about our history. I just got curious about it, so I thought I'd share it. First episode was with Christina Remlin, then of Children's Rights. Now I believe she's with a group called Public Knowledge. who joined to talk about political battles being waged over faith-based child welfare providers seeking to choose who they will and will not serve. And then we talked about the coronavirus relief package and the end of California's youth prisons on that first episode. Those feel like many, many stories ago to me. Our most frequent guest is Sarita Cox, who is the co-founder of iFoster. She came on pretty early in the coronavirus pandemic to talk about how iFoster had kind of sourced and shipped out a ton of phones and computers to current and former foster youth out there in California and some other states, which would prove to be kind of an important thing to do as we all went into isolation. She narrowly edged out University of Michigan legal expert Vivek Sankaran. Sarita's been on 4 times. Vivek has been on 3. All-time recorded downloads as of when I'm recording this are 96,696. I was really hoping against hope we would cross the 100,000 download mark right as we were doing episode 200. But maybe if a bunch of people listen to this one, we'll cross it with this episode. Best month we ever had was February of 2023. We had 3,663 downloads that month, which was, I guess, surprising to me because it's a short month. Obviously, a couple less days than most months. Also, a thing that for the future I feel good about because actually in that month, that tracks the 3,600 plus downloads is more than just the ones we released that month. But actually 2 of the guest interviews that we did that month were actually with my colleague Nancy Marie Spears, who is a reporter with the Imprint. So kind of a tip towards the future. For me, I really feel like we're going to have more people doing more podcasts and you're not going to hear from me all the time as we go forward. Most downloaded episode ever was Jerry Milner, who was the head of the Children's Bureau during the first Trump administration. And more than that, he runs the Family Justice Group now and was administrator with the Alabama's child welfare system and worked with Bush. I feel like I just call him Trump's child welfare director all the time. That's not fair. He's done more than that. But anyway, Jerry did join us in November of 2024, right after President Trump was reelected, just to kind of discuss what he thought would be the priorities and what might not be in a second Trump administration. Most popular topic, I'd say either by downloads or by number of specific episodes, is the Indian Child Welfare Act. And that's pretty reasonable when you figure that, in the course of the 4 years and change that we have been releasing this podcast, most of that time, there was a massive Supreme Court legal challenge to the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So we've had lots of great experts and writers and child welfare practitioners on to do everything from talk about sort of the big picture context for ICWA, more of the nitty gritty stuff, trying to explain, what all these different parts of the Indian Child Welfare Act were, and just basically trying to break down, a fairly complicated Supreme Court case multiple times throughout its history as it moved through the Fifth Circuit and then into the Supreme Court and oral arguments and the decision and all that stuff. So anyway, thank you for listening. Here's to the next 100 episodes. And if you have a topic or someone you'd love to hear on this podcast, hit me up at tips@imprintnews.org. And if you just want to support us, like I said, if you got a business or something you want to promote, you can advertise with us. You can just use that same email, tips@imprintnews.org. Or you can just give us a donation. Help us keep this thing going. imprintnews.org/donate if you want to do that. Okay, as I mentioned, before we get to the headlines today, I wanted to bring in a young woman doing something pretty cool in New York City. Cheyanne Deopersaud experienced the foster care system growing up in New York City and has written powerfully for us before about the need for quality, safe housing options in the system for older youth. With the New York City mayoral race heating up, she wanted to make sure that the candidates had to get on the record about their views on important topics related to vulnerable kids in her city. So she set up a mayoral forum, which will be held on Thursday, April 17th at 5 p.m. Cheyanne, thanks for jumping on with the Imprint Weekly Podcast to talk about that. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me.
Let's get these guys to know you a little bit before we talk to you about the forum. You got to give me one favorite, at least, in these categories. You can give me more if you want. TV show or movie, sports team, book, or musical group. What do you got for the people?
Oh, that's a very good question. I wrote them down. My favorite TV show is How I Met Your Mother right now, and I just finished it, and I can't believe the mother died at the end. Um,
Spoiler alert for the 10 people that haven't seen that show yet.
I don't watch sports, so I can't say about anything on that. And my favorite musical group, I have to go with right now the Jonas Brothers. Like, I love the Jonas Brothers. I love everything they've ever made before when they were younger and then they got back together. They're just so great. I love Joe Jonas.
There you go. We got How I Met Your Mother and the Jonas Brothers for you from Cheyanne. Okay, so what made you first decide you wanted to take this on? This is a tough thing to kind of corral a bunch of people during campaign time. And, what has it been like logistically to spearhead something like this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I decided to take this on because in the last mayoral elections don't happen all the time. They only happen once every 4 years. And so it's a really, really important time and important thing for youth voice to be a part of. And so last mayoral cycle in 2021, me and Teens Take Charge, I was a part of their team and we did a mayoral forum and it turned out amazing because a lot of youth were passionate about summer youth employment program getting cut. And so I kind of wanted to do the exact same thing, have this forum be youth led, virtual, available to all youth throughout New York City. They're able to like register and put in a question. And we're having youth themselves ask the question on the forum. And it's going to be definitely geared towards issues that youth find that needs to be addressed. A lot of these forums sometimes have youth, but it's not like youth driven. And
Mhm.
so a lot of organizations come together and pose questions, but it comes from a different point of view than what ours is coming from. And I'm really, really excited about it. But the campaigns have been amazing, and I'm really excited to see what all of the candidates are going to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, one of the hardest things to do is getting these candidates to commit. How has that been going? I think there's like a dozen candidates in this race at this point, right? Something like that.
I think so. Well, it was hard at first because they're all so busy and they have like a lot of forums and things to do for their campaign. So at first it was definitely it's really just a process and talking to those campaigns and things of that sort. But this forum is geared for the Democratic primary. So all of the candidates who are running for Democratic nomination are going to be on that ticket are invited to our forum. And they've been really great in communicating with us. And right now we have Adrian Adams, Michael Blake, Brad Landers, Eleanor Myrie, Jessica Ramos, Scott Stringer, and Whitney Tilson able to join us for our forum. So that is everybody except for Zoran Mamdani and Andrew Cuomo. And if you're hearing this, please answer our email.
What are the topics? What can we expect to hear questions about?
So right now the format we have questions regarding to issues around housing, education, employment, child welfare, the juvenile justice system, and things like safety on the subway. We also have questions around SYEP. I think at the moment we have 300 people signed up and they all like have inputted really amazing questions. And so we're trying to do cool activities that get to the root of what the youth want to know while also approaching it in a different way. So right now we have like a cool spin the wheel, answer the question
Right.
activity. We have a rapid fire section where it's like yes or no answers, answer this in like 20 seconds in one sentence. We have a budget exercise that we're doing for the candidates and we're thinking about like how they would allocate their budget in certain like sections and things of that sort. And then we're also like thinking about a call the mayor activity where a youth calls the mayor and tells them about an issue that they're having with real life roadblocks and asking the candidates how they would respond to it on
Oh my God, that's such a great idea. Almost like a pop quiz in the middle of
yes,
the forum.
yes,
I
exactly.
wonder if these guys know what they're up against right now. Not
We're
up against, they're going to be, it's what they're supposed to be doing. Be on the
A
spot,
hundred percent, 100%. It's their
Yeah.
job to answer the tough questions, especially like and hearing the other ones answer and just to show what kind of mayor they would be for New York City. It's really, really important. So I'm really excited.
Yeah. Well, obviously, anybody that listens to us or reads us in New York City and New York State should attend this and check this out. I think for our listeners elsewhere, this would be a good thing to check out to see because this is something we could replicate where I'm at. Because no matter where you are, you've got a mayor or a board of supervisors or whatever, and they all have to run and they should all answer questions about what they want to do for the youth who most need them in their communities. So With all of that said, Cheyanne, just remind them again of the day, the time, and how they can register for free to attend your forum.
Yeah, definitely. So it's on April 17th from 5 to 7 p.m. and it's virtual. So you can basically join from anywhere and watch the forum. And you can register on our Eventbrite. It's called youthinfocus.eventbrite.com.
Excellent. And I will, for anybody that wants to check out our show notes, include the wonderful op-ed that Cheyanne wrote for us. And I will also include the link for people to register for this. So Cheyanne, thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Okay, when we come back, we will try and cover at least some of the many, many headlines from the past month or so.
Today's episode is powered by Listen, a groundbreaking AI platform transforming how child welfare and other public sector providers learn and grow. Imagine being able to roll out comprehensive, secure training and quality monitoring across your entire organization instantly. That's exactly what Listen delivers to over 70 public and private sector clients. Developed by PhD academic psychologists, Listen helps health and human services agencies master motivational interviewing and other evidence-based practices. And this isn't just another training tool. It's backed by 16 years of rigorous research and peer-reviewed studies. To learn more, visit listen.io. That's lyssn.io. lyssn.io, or follow the link in the show notes.
All right, let's do some headlines for the month. We're going to stick with Washington, D.C. for the most part because the fire hose continues in terms of news coming out of there. But I will get to some recommendations of some imprint coverage and some other journalism that I really recommend from around the country from the last month or so. Let's begin with the nomination of the first, true child welfare focused individual for Trump's second term, and that is Alex Adams, who has been nominated to be the Assistant Secretary overseeing the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF. Now, ACF is one of the larger agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, which is obviously what most people know, led by RFK Jr. So who is Alex Adams? Well, most immediately, he is the director of Idaho's Department of Health and Welfare. Now, that is an agency that oversees far more than child welfare, but child welfare is part of the remit there. He's only been in that job since the summer of 2024, though. So I would say that he's, just being objectively fairly short on direct leadership experience within the child welfare rubric. He is a pharmacist by training. He spent, 6 years with the National Association of Chain Drugstores. He was the executive director of the Idaho State Board of Pharmacy for 3 years. But I think in addition to having some familiarity now with what's going on in child welfare from that, just under a year spent kind of on the front line with that Department of Health and Welfare, I think it's the other state role that he filled in recent history with Idaho that is sort of what propelled him into a job with the Trump administration, is that he spent 5 years with the Division of Financial Management. And in that job, he helped as a sort of an architect of sorts, or one of the people kind of prominently involved in the development of Idaho's zero-based regulation program. And that is a concept that is widely celebrated by, conservative think tanks as sort of a good governance approach to doing regulation and things like that. So the kind of core 4 tenets of what's called zero-based regulation are sunset provisions. So, anytime you're making a regulation, having it set to end as opposed to forcing people into a situation where they need to proactively end something. Instead, they would be focused on, defending the need for it to continue. Regulatory budgets, regulatory impact analyses, and independent reviews. I'm going to drop a link into the show notes for somebody that wants to read a little bit more into what zero-based regulation is. It's a piece by the Manhattan Institute that kind of breaks this thing down. And the reason I wanted to call this out is first because I do think if you kind of just do a very basic search for sort of things that Alex Adams has prominently been involved in, zero-based regulation is one of them. He has posts on his LinkedIn page, sort of celebrating the fact that the Trump administration and the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, has embraced this concept of zero-based regulation to some extent. Anyway, all of that to say, I think it's obvious from what we've talked about on the podcast for the last year or so that the Biden administration got pretty busy towards the end, putting in new rules, regulations, things like that around child welfare. They did some rulemaking around kinship care and how states might be able to provide a different path to licensing kin and requiring them to be compensated or financially supported in the same level as other foster parents. There were protections put in for, affirming placements for LGBTQ youth, attorneys for both parents and children, and how financial funds for that could be used. There were certainly other ones. And there's just dozens and dozens, obviously, of regulations going back many, many administrations that kind of just, to extent dictate the interaction between the federal government and state and local child welfare systems. So, I think it's going to be interesting that this is not a person who is in here just to oversee child welfare. The ACF has child welfare as a big part of it, but it also, oversees the temporary assistance for needy families, the federal welfare program, which we're going to talk about again in a minute, Social Security block grants, the Office of Refugee Resettlement. We've talked about that many times on the podcast. It oversees the Unaccompanied Minors program, which is really the only kind of federally run foster care system, and all kinds of other programs, either built around, child safety and more often just, family support systems. So just sort of Occam's razor. I have no, strong intel on this from anybody close to Mr. Adams or really from the Trump administration or anything like that. Just seems logical that if you've got a person who spent the last year or so really getting very familiar on the job with child welfare and family supports and all kinds of other stuff in that human services realm, and he has a pretty significant background in developing an approach to regulation, but also deregulation at the same time. And if you look at that Manhattan Institute write-up, I posted the links. I mean, the number of regulations in Idaho has plummeted, since they implemented zero-based regulation. It seems obvious that that's a part, at least, of the reason that he is getting into this job. And, I expect that he'll get some questions, probably from both sides of the aisle when it comes time for him to have his confirmation hearing about that. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what his views are. When he went into that job in Idaho, like I said, they were having a bit of a placement crisis where they were routing a lot of kids to very expensive places they didn't necessarily want them to have to be in. And, part of the solution to that was kind of quickly deregulating the path for kin to become caregivers in a way that made it easier for them. So to be continued on that, we will continue to sort of update people as this nomination moves forward, because it is the biggest job within the child welfare realm. I mean, there's, the Health and Human Services Secretary. Obviously, there's some folks at the White House, Domestic Policy Council, who will have a lot of say in child welfare policy. But the person in charge of ACF, if they want to be, can really be the most influential voice. No news yet on people for some of the lower positions under that at ACF. There is, of course, the Administration on Children, Youth, and Families, which is a part of ACF. No nomination there. That is a job that requires Senate confirmation, and they have not yet appointed somebody to lead the Children's Bureau, which is actually an agency that kind of predates all of the ones that we're talking about here. It's like more than 100 years old. That doesn't need Senate confirmation. So that is a situation where, we find out they are appointed. They're going to be on the job pretty quickly thereafter. But that is a good segue to what I wanted to talk about next, because I don't think at this point you could honestly look at what's going on at the Department of Health and Human Services and say, for sure which jobs, whether it's child welfare or any other ones, are going to be filled and what might end up being part of a reorganization that leads to, either the merger or closure of different aspects of HHS. So, just a few weeks ago, the Department of Health and Human Services and RFK Jr. announced this very large reorganization that was going to entail a reduction in force by, I think, 10,000 full-time employees, 20,000 if you included, part-timers or contractors. The external communications on this reorganization were pretty vague right off the bat, and there has not been much by the way of amplifying information. So I'm going to tell you what we have learned either from, external communications from HHS or from, people who are close to, the Administration on Children and Families and the sort of related departments that we cover here at the Imprint quite often. So this top line, the reorganization is going to entail a lot of centralization of human resources stuff. That's IT, external affairs. It also lists in the sort of fact sheet on the overall reorganization that the centralization of policy will happen. That one is of particular interest. I mean, my understanding is that there's lots of different departments within ACF, and they all have, to some extent, policymaking shops. We'll see if centralization of policy truly means there's just nothing that is actually carried out by, the folks at ACF, the Administration on Children and Families, that might have expertise in that, and that's all going to move into the central office. If truly all policy actions, like including a letter to state agencies or an informational memorandum, are moved into this centralized operation, that certainly seems as though it would lower the scope of direct influence for a place like ACF, or at least require a lot more upward sign-off before things happen. Stepping aside from ACF, which is really our focal, agency within the Health and Human Services, the Administration for Community Living is set to be essentially closed, and its responsibilities will be scattered throughout other parts of HHS. And one of the sort of receiving entities, I guess, will be the Administration for Children and Families. Now, the Administration for Community Living helps states with funds and other assistance to help seniors and people with disabilities. So not a direct line to child welfare, but there are two ways, at least, in which the Administration for Community Living does play a role in the child welfare continuum. I'll just name them here. One is the National Family Caregiver Support Program, and its closely related Native American Family Caregiver Support Program. Those were established in law in 2000, collectively passes along about $200 million into communities to help support older Americans, and that means 55 and up, who are caring for children of loved ones. And that money flows from the federal government into these local entities called area agencies on aging. And those area agencies on aging, that is a mouthful, can use it for, referral services, respite care, individual counseling, things that can help a senior caregiver who is now kind of in charge of a child at a point in their life when they probably didn't see that coming. So that is one. The other is the Home and Community-Based Services. It's a $392 million program. Now, there's a Medicaid program by the same name, and it's focused on helping people with disabilities, including kids, live at home and without the need for institutionalization or residential care. This is a pretty significant part of Medicaid at a time when we continue to report over and over again, really see this playing out in a whole bunch of states. There is, a shortage of states are complaining about a lack of options to put youth with really acute mental health needs. And I'm not saying that that's not true. Of course, the leadership in those places probably every day are seeing, kids come into their orbit, whether it's child welfare or mental health or whatever, and seeing the lack of beds to go to with that kid in some place where they know they're going to be safe and their family's going to be safe. But, I think we can all agree that there is another part of that problem, and this is kind of articulated well in the sort of class action lawsuit against New York State that's been filed by Children's Rights and other litigators, that that problem today where you don't have places to put kids is born to some extent. I mean, people have mental health breaks in a short amount of time, but it is born somewhat of our lack of ability to find community-based solutions to help with mental health before it becomes that enormous emergency. And that is something that, is articulated, like I said, in that lawsuit. There's this huge waiting list to get into community services. So anyway, all that to say, home and community-based services is sort of a part of the Medicaid fabric. And this program at the Administration for Community Living kind of is like a buffer support for that Medicaid program. So, where does that land? I would guess that is going to be the part that goes to ACF. I'd be surprised if the family caregiver support program wasn't destined for ACF as well, just because it just seems like the best fit if you're not going to have this administration for community living exist anymore, which seems to be the plan. Now, going back to the Administration for Children and Families, ACF, here is what we've been able to gather at the Imprint, mostly from, people who are close to ACF in some way, who are, trying to get as much information as they can, because there really isn't any sort of thing on paper, it seems, that really articulates the patterns of layoffs and things like that within all these different HHS agencies. So I think I had mentioned the last time I did an update on the podcast that, pretty early on in the Doge experiment, there were about 200 workers from ACF who were given termination notices or put on an administration leave and set for termination because of their probationary status. And that is, it sounds like it's just all brand new people, and it might be to the position they're in, but a lot of those people probably came from a different department within the executive branch of government. Maybe they came over from the Department of Education to ACF or from another part of HHS. So those were the first people to kind of be put on notice. And then on April 1st, there were something to the order of 500 ACF employees who were given reduction in force notices and told that their jobs would be ending in June. They're all on administrative leave until then. And overall, the staffing footprint at the Administration for Children and Families has gone from 2,400 in January of 2025, when the president was inaugurated, to about 1,500 after this reduction in force slate on April 1st. Although, like I said, technically those people are largely still employees, at least until June. And I would imagine there are grievances being filed, maybe litigation to challenge at least the way the reduction in force, process happened. A lot of the people that we're talking about here are in unions. It is unlikely that they would, let this go down without some sort of legal fight of some kind, right? Okay, so that's the sort of overall picture, but it's not the case that this is just kind of spread evenly across ACF. What we're hearing is that the number of regional offices has essentially been downsized from 10 to 5. Now, these regional offices, a lot of the staff of, most federal agencies is based in Washington, D.C. or somewhere right around it in the suburbs of Maryland and Virginia. But there are these regional offices. There's 10 of them all over the country that cover various groups of states and territories, Puerto Rico, all over the country. And it seems that the plan, although again, I don't think I've seen this officially put anywhere, but maybe it is to go from 10 regional offices now down to 5. And I saw somebody on LinkedIn post suggesting that the regions that are being downsized, at least right now, through reduction of force notices. So just to back up a second, at the very least, it does seem ironclad that the staff of 5 regional offices have been largely wiped out. I spoke with a person who had gotten a reduction of force notice on April 1st. That person was attached to, the work of one part of ACF in a region, but they also related to me that everybody in the ACF regional building attached to pretty much everything involved, like almost all of them were gone. Now, going back to what I was going to say, I saw it kind of, intimated online, like if you look at the regions where this is happening and it seems destined for closure, they are the regions that tend to have the most blue states, quote unquote. Although I don't think that's always the case where, I'm not sure how you want to quantify a state that, for instance, has like a Democratic governor, but everything else about it is red, like maybe Kentucky or something like that. Anyway, maybe I don't know that for sure. It does also seem relevant that the regions that are being closed are in places, the offices are in places like Seattle and New York, San Francisco. These are for sure more expensive than some of the regional offices just to maintain, right? Rent, lease, space, staffing, pay, all that stuff than the other ones. Could be a mix of both. Who knows? Anyway, so we'll be reporting more on this at the Imprint, so kind of stay tuned. But that regional operation, seems like the plan is to get that pared down to less people and less regional offices. Two other ones that we have heard, have been pretty much zeroed out in terms of just like workforce, are the staff within temporary assistance for needy families. I mentioned before, and we're going to talk about a study on TANF in just a minute, but TANF is, the successor to the more traditional welfare program in 1996 when they did the very famous bipartisan, welfare reauthorization. We switched from AFDC, aid to families of dependent children, to TANF. Went from sort of an entitlement structure to this block grant of like $16 billion and change that goes out to states. So, it appears like most of the staff involved with TANF are gone. Same for the social services block grant, which is another, not nearly as big as TANF, but it's several $1 billion a year that goes out to states to help them, and with pretty flexible funding to apply to just the safety net in general. So that's what we know. We will certainly be, we had a lot of reporters kind of focused on this and asking around. If you have information that you think we should know about regarding what's going on within ACF and the Department of Health and Human Services or the Department of Justice, been somewhat quieter thus far, but obviously they run point on juvenile justice policy, which is something we care very deeply about at the Imprint. Hit us up, tips@imprintnews.org. We also have a Signal account for folks that want to reach us in that way, which is imprintnews.76. Last bit of Trump administration news before we move on to some other stuff. Last time we did a headlines edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast, I mentioned that there had sort of been a back and forth on the decision to end funding for legal counsel to unaccompanied minors who arrive at the border without their parents. I'm not going to get all into this. I'll drop some links for people that want to read a little bit more about this, because we did do a quick story kind of updating things here. But basically, the unaccompanied minors program, like I mentioned earlier in this podcast, kind of like the truly only federal foster care program. Kids show up at the border, a lot of them from Central America. They are seeking asylum or some sort of protection within the country. They are apprehended by Customs and Border Patrol, but then within a short window are turned over to the Department of Health and Human Services, whose job at that point is kind of two-pronged. First, you find shelter for them. There's sort of a network of, residential programs when things have gotten really at a peak level of kids flowing in. We were doing that in a fairly haphazard way with lots of people thrown in. I think there was like a Target store that had gone out of business that got turned into a shelter, crazy stuff like that, military bases. But there's sort of a more tried or true network of like residential care providers who take those kids. And then the job is to find a suitable sponsor for them. It could be a parent or family member that's in the country while their court case kind of moves towards a decision on if they will get asylum or not. So they stay there at the residential shelters, food, care, education, all that stuff, provided until a sponsor is found. They go to that sponsor, and then the idea is you're with that sponsor as that court case proceeds. Okay, I'm bringing this back up again because about 2 months ago, the Trump administration notified the sort of main provider of legal counsel to the kids I'm talking about here, which is called the Acacia Center, that they would be, basically halting the contract and ending it, fairly abruptly. We're talking about, I think more than $1 billion that goes out to provide this counsel for these kids. And we're talking about like mostly teenagers, but there's kids like below 10 that are in this. And so that was stop work order was then rescinded like 2 days later, and now has been essentially reinstituted. So they've officially, notified Acacia that this program will be, essentially terminated. There's a very tiny part of the legal counsel program that will survive, at least for a time, because under law, there's some know your rights type of work that's sort of required to do with the kids. But, the bottom line here is this is, for a long time, there was not legal counsel afforded to most of these kids. And I want to say during the 2022 budget deal, there was like $500 million put in as like an annual line, something like that, for the provision of to fund legal counsel for them. And now we're going back to a situation where, frankly, we're expecting teenagers to go before an immigration court without a lawyer, unless somehow their family and them can afford one, to make what I would imagine is a fairly complex legal argument for their status and the need for asylum or some other protection. So just an update that is where things lie there. I mentioned the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program a little earlier and said there was kind of something else I wanted to mention on this front. So the Government Accountability Office, we all know as GAO, has done a bunch of different reports on TANF lately, and there have been quite a few hearings about TANF at the House Ways and Means Committee. One of the reports they released most recently, just last week, was sort of an analysis of the way in which TANF money is being used by states to pay for child welfare services. So just sort of set the table here. Like I said before, in 1997 or 96, I guess, TANF replaced the sort of entitlement welfare program. And it's basically a block grant that gets down to these states, $16.7 billion, I think, or something like that. And they can use it really for kind of two big boxes. You can provide direct financial assistance to low-income households with that money, sort of the thing we all think of as like welfare payments, or you can do non-cash assistance support for those same families. So you can contract and make grants to nonprofits or anybody else to assist low-income households. And one thing that's really come up at these hearings that I feel like there might be some bipartisan support to change here is that these states really don't have a lot of requirements federally to provide much granular information on what they're spending money on when it comes to this non-cash assistance. And it's a big deal because the whole playing field around how TANF is used has changed just tremendously. We had Ashley Burnside on last summer to talk a little bit about this with us. But, in 1997, right, the year after TANF was created, the vast majority of the TANF funds that were going out to states were then used to provide financial assistance directly to families. I think it was 77% in 1997. That's down to like a quarter of the money. So the majority of the money is now spent on this more nebulous group. Now, like I said, there's not a lot of granularity on what's being, what that money is being used for, but GAO was able to go in and sort of get an assessment from states from the period between 2015 and 2022, so I guess it's a 7-year window, how much of that TANF non-cash assistance was being used for child welfare. And what they found was between in that window, 2015 to 2022, states spent $23.5 billion of TANF funds on child welfare. The majority of states reported that money went into child welfare services, and that could mean a lot of things. It could mean services aimed at preventing the removal of kids, because the majority of child welfare cases don't involve that. It could be reunification services, could be a whole bunch of different things. And then a smaller group of states said they actually use TANF dollars to pay for foster care placements, either to kinship caregivers or to foster parents. And the way in which that happens most often, I believe, is you've got another big federal entitlement called Title 4E that pays for foster care placements. And when states can use that, they will, if they can determine that a child is 4E eligible and that has its own income and means testing involved in it. When they can't use that, they will, and I'm not saying all states, some states will tap into TANF to pay for caregivers for the other states. I would say I was surprised by that number. I certainly am aware, and we've worked on stories and are working on stories about the role of TANF in child welfare, that it was $23.5 billion. I mean, Title 4E, which I just mentioned, is the biggest federal payer of child welfare services. It pays for, preventative services. That's a very small amount of what people use it for now. The bigger uses are foster care payments, adoption incentives, and adoption subsidies, and then sort of administrative services related to all those things. So Title 4E in this window from 2015 to 2022 is $68.6 billion. So TANF is really, it's like a third of the size of Title 4E now in terms of how it's being used for child welfare services. That's quite a bit. And actually, this is another thing that the GAO kind of serviced here. It's kind of likely that it's an undercount because there's a rule that enables states to take like up to 10% of their TANF bucks and move it over to the social services block grant, which is, a much more flexible pot of money that states can use to fund any number of things related to human services. So that is another program, social services block grant, that is widely used by states to fund child welfare related expenditures. So if you just figure, some of these states, a lot of these states are transferring some of their TANF money over to SSBG because it is more flexible. It's easier to use there. They are using some of that money as child welfare services, and it's not counting kind of directly as TANF. So anyway, I think I just wanted to call this report out because it was really interesting, and I'll link to it in the show notes along with a link to the hearing. As far as congressional hearings goes, a pretty quick one that I think would be, a pretty good primer, honestly, on like what the conversation is around TANF here as we get into it. But, bigger picture, I wanted to mention this because this report, gets to some concerns and some facts around the use of both TANF and the social services block grant at a time where you see DOJ coming in and doing reductions in forces that sort of zero out the staff that are focused on those programs. I don't want to say all of them, but a lot of the staff at ACF that are focused on TANF and SSBG. And we've got, spending negotiations coming and congressional budget framework that has, obviously been in the news a lot around, instructions to cut Medicaid. These are two smaller programs, certainly than Medicaid, but they're very big parts of the social safety net as far as federal funding is concerned. And it does seem particularly relevant that there's this spotlight on them in terms of how the money is being used, and the staff who oversee them are being downsized while there's conversations around what to cut out of, the Health and Human Services budget by Congress. So this is something that we're just going to, keep a very close eye on as, the spending and budget process moves forward in Washington this year. All right, last piece of DC-ish news before we move on to some recommendations for you guys, and that is that prosecutors in Washington, D.C. have withdrawn the charges against James McIntyre, a 33-year-old former foster youth, now foster youth advocate, who was arrested after a reception at Capitol Hill in mid-December. We talked about this case a bit, I think, in a January episode of the podcast, and we've certainly written quite a few stories about it at the Imprint that I will link folks to. But basically, just in a nutshell, there was an event in December, pretty much an all-day thing to sort of celebrate and call attention to the 25th anniversary of the Chafee program, which is sort of the main federal program focused on older foster youth and supporting them as they transition into adulthood. There was a reception after kind of the day's main events. And at that event, McIntyre was in attendance. I was there. There were a lot of people there. One of the co-chairs of the Congressional Foster Youth Caucus at the time was Representative Nancy Mace, who made some brief remarks and was walking out of the room when Mr. McIntyre came up to her and shook her hand and told her that trans youth deserve advocacy too. And I'll just link you to the story so you can read sort of the context for why he had said that to her. Now, Representative Mace reported the incident to the police and said that she felt threatened. They arrested McIntyre. He was arraigned the next day and pleaded not guilty. This is all in December. And, going into like early April, this was still on the docket. It seemed headed for, all the things that happened before a trial, discovery, what have you. And then pretty abruptly in that first week, I want to say on April 2nd, the prosecutors filed what's called a nolle prosequi. I'm sure I'm murdering that Latin. But basically what that means is that they are withdrawing the charges without prejudice, meaning that in theory, I guess if new evidence came to light or something like that, they would be free to go ahead and file charges and seek prosecution of Mr. McIntyre again. But for all intents and purposes, this case has been dismissed and it is over. I'll also drop our quick column on this sort of related thing in the show notes if people want to read a little bit more. But, we have learned also that Representative Mace, since this, sort of quietly withdrew herself from the Congressional Foster Youth Caucus. Appears to have happened sometime around February. There wasn't like any announcement that she was leaving or that anybody was replacing her or anything like that. But if you just kind of look using the Wayback Machine at sort of when names changed on the website and things like that, looks like around February, Representative Aaron Houchin of Indiana was updated on the sort of leadership list of the Congressional Foster Youth Caucus. Mace's office did confirm to us that yes, she is no longer with the Congressional Foster Youth Caucus. So I guess in summary, the charges have been withdrawn. In theory, they could be put up again. It does not seem likely. So, really the question now is whether this is over, or whether there might be civil action one way or another in this case. We'll continue to report on it as is necessary. But it does seem like the criminal prosecution of Mr. McIntyre regarding this event is over. All right, I feel like we have blown past the 1 hour mark on this episode, so I do apologize for being long-winded today, but there was a lot to get to in Washington. We really didn't even get to a lot about budget and federal spending or anything like that. We're going to have a few guests on to talk about some of the weightier issues there. Zach Laris is coming on soon to talk about Medicaid. Obviously, that's on the chopping block, some of Medicaid, so we'll get to that and lots of other stuff. I did want to close out just recommending a few things that my colleagues at the Imprint have put out lately. This is not an exhaustive list. You should sign up for our newsletter for that, so you get that weekly hit of just everything that we've been working on as a team. But just a few pretty cool things that we've put out to the world. I'm going to start with Medicated and Foster Care, Who's Looking Out? This is a series of stories led by reporter Michael Fitzgerald. And sort of at the core of it, we reported out beyond this, but, Michael did a review of child welfare policy manuals in all 50 states. And what he found, among other things, is that at least 10 states still don't have, any policies for caregivers, caseworkers, and medical providers on the use of psychotropic medication for kids in foster care. You might be wondering, okay, well, why do we need specific regulations or rules for those kids? And it is the case that, Medicaid, which is the main payer of, mental health drugs and services for a lot of youth in the country, they have their own rules. But it's been known for decades that prescriptions of psychotropic medications to youth in foster care just greatly outpace the number that are prescribed to kids just around the country. There is also kind of a more acute issue of polypharmacy, where you're seeing kids in foster care very often prescribe multiple drugs at the same time. And this is something that some states have taken seriously and got serious about and tried to put some regulations in place on. But, this is still an issue that is present today. There was a recent federal review of Medicaid claims that Michael writes about it in the series, covers 700,000 child welfare involved youth, and it found that, there's 24 states that are prescribing this sort of broader class of psychotropics to about a third of child welfare involved youth. So that's 2 to 4 times the rate of other children. And that Medicaid study identified 100,000 kids that were receiving at least 2 psychotropics at the same time. And this stuff obviously has, pretty well-known side effects and health risks involved. So it's a great series. Michael's sort of like first day story on it really goes in depth on sort of where we are policy wise with this. And it also takes a look at, some of the things that a few states have taken on to better regulate or at least know about what's going on with patterns of prescriptions for youth in their system. And also you have a chance in the last piece of the series to sort of hear directly from some current or former foster youth who've experienced this issue and who have been medicated while they were in foster care. So that's one. Another headline for you: Texas lawmakers take on a little-known pathway into foster care, parents seeking mental health treatment for their children. So this is a watch their space situation. I think we'll have some more reporting on this. And I mentioned a couple months ago on the podcast that, a federal study looking at some pretty recent years of data found that something on the order of 5% of foster care entries are attributable to, what's generally described, that I think the parlance is different from state to state, as relinquishment. This is not a parent being found to have, abused or neglected a child, but are seeking for their child to enter foster care for another reason. And that reason is often the behavioral health of the child themselves. So Sarah Tiano reports on this out of Texas. More than 500 children, or 6% of all the Texas foster care entries, came in under these circumstances related to mental health issues that their parents couldn't handle. That number is slightly higher than the national average that I just mentioned. And Tiano covers some of the legislative, efforts that are now being taken on to sort of prevent this sort of pipeline from behavioral health needs of parents into foster care in the state. Because I think I've chatted sort of offline with some people that really know Texas child welfare. I think their big concern is that parents do this thinking, well, the state will be able to, take my child and afford for them a much better, mental health response than I could afford or I can do at home. And what's really happening in a lot of these cases is these kids end up in, without a real placement. They're sleeping in offices or some sort of alternative way of lodging them, not really into sort of, the acute mental health facility that the parent might imagine. Fourth headline for you. This is by reporter Stephen Yoder. It's called "Albany County Pledged to Move Towards Zero Youth Detention. How is it doing?" So about 5 years ago, Albany County, New York, which is obviously the capital county, decided to set a goal for zero youth detention. And what Yoder did was sort of come in and take a look at how they're doing. It's a pretty interesting story about basically a 5-year period that has seen some tumult on the issue of youth justice, let's put it that way, in New York. And, this is something that obviously Albany County pledged to do, but they are certainly not the only ones. I just off the top of my head believe that Hawaii made a similar sort of goal setting to basically zero out youth detention. And I think San Francisco and King County in Washington, which is Seattle, did the same. So this is Yoder's kind of local look at what those efforts have yielded. And last one that I just want to call out is called "Buried But Not Forgotten." A Colorado archaeologist describes her work honoring the lives of Indian boarding school students. This is by Nancy Marie Spears, our Indigenous Children and Families reporter. And it's just a cool story that looks at how these researchers are using kind of ground penetrating radar and drones to search for remains of Native children who attended boarding schools. And this is obviously something we've talked about on the podcast before. Nancy has written about a whole bunch. It was a big focus for the Department of the Interior during the Biden administration, when Secretary Deb Haaland really kind of led the charge to looking into, the history of boarding schools, among other, issues related to Indigenous children and families. She's now running for governor in New Mexico. But we'll see what the Trump administration does in this space, if anything. And with that, I will conclude this 200th episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Thank you so much to SpeakRight, which was our lead sponsor for this 200th episode. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Anjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we'd really appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories of child welfare and youth justice. To support us is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can also email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly. I'll see you next week.